The morning mist clung to the ground as the sun began to rise over the city of Toulouse. Inside the city walls, the people were in a panic. They had heard the news. A massive army was marching toward them, led by a king who was determined to claim Toulouse as his own. King Henry II of England, the most powerful ruler in Western Europe, was on the move, and he had brought with him an army so huge that it seemed to stretch from one horizon to the other. The streets of Toulouse were filled with the sounds of fear and confusion. Women clutched their children tightly, and men armed themselves with whatever weapons they could find. The city's ruler, Count Raymond V, was preparing for a fight he knew he might not win. The walls of Toulouse, ancient and strong, were the city's best defense, but even they might not be enough to stop the relentless force that was advancing. Outside the city, the air was thick with the sounds of war. The tread of thousands of footsteps, the creaking of war machines, and the blare of trumpets filled the air. Henry's army was a fearsome sight. Knights in shining armor, foot soldiers with swords and shields, and archers with their bows ready to fire. At the head of this massive force rode King Henry II himself, a man known for his ambition and his ruthlessness. Henry was not just a king, he was a conqueror. He had already secured his rule over England, Normandy, and Aquitaine, and now he was determined to add Toulouse to his growing empire. His claim to the city was based on a tenuous connection through his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, but that was enough for him. He was a man who believed in asserting his rights, no matter the cost. Among the ranks of Henry's army was a man who stood out from the rest. Thomas Becket, the Chancellor of England and Archdeacon of Canterbury, was a key figure in the campaign. Despite his role in the church, Becket was not afraid to ride into battle. He led a group of knights, his armor gleaming in the sunlight, ready to fight for his king. Becket was more than just a counselor. He was a trusted friend and a powerful ally. The siege of Toulouse began in the early summer of 1159. Henry's army set up camp outside the city walls, and the sounds of war echoed through the countryside. The people of Toulouse watched in horror as the invaders ravaged the surrounding lands, burning crops, plundering villages, and destroying everything in their path. The city was surrounded, and the people inside knew that the only way out was through the walls that protected them. Inside the city, Count Raymond V was not idle. He knew that the walls of Toulouse were his best defense, and he ordered his men to reinforce them. The city was divided into three sections: the ancient Roman city, the walled burg, and the Chateau Narbonnais, where the count himself resided. The walls were thick, and the city was well supplied with food and water. Toulouse was a tough nut to crack, and Count Raymond was determined to hold out as long as he could. For months, the siege dragged on. Henry's army launched attacks, but the walls of Toulouse proved too strong. The people inside the city suffered, but they refused to give in. The king's men tried everything they could, from catapulting stones and burning arrows over the walls to digging tunnels to undermine the city's defenses. But Toulouse stood firm. As the siege continued, tensions grew. King Henry was a man used to getting his way, and the failure to capture Toulouse was a blow to his pride. His advisors, including Becket, urged him to be patient, but the king's frustration was palpable. The longer the siege went on, the more questions began to arise about the wisdom of the campaign. But the real turning point came in the early autumn. The people of Toulouse had a powerful ally, and he was on his way. King Louis VII of France, the man to whom Henry had sworn fealty, was marching to the city's aid. Louis was not just a king, he was a brother-in-law to Count Raymond V. If Henry decided to attack Toulouse with the French king present, it would be an act of war against his own feudal overlord. When Louis arrived, the mood in Henry's camp changed. The king and his advisors knew that they were now facing a much more significant challenge. Attacking Toulouse with Louis at the city's side would mean a full-scale war with the French king, a conflict that could unravel Henry's carefully constructed empire. Henry called a meeting with his barons and key advisors, including Becket. The tension was thick as they debated their next move. Becket, ever the loyal supporter, called for an immediate assault on the city, but the majority of the barons counseled caution. They argued that it was too risky to attack the French king, especially when there was no specific insult to Henry's honor. In the end, King Henry made his decision. He would not risk all he had built. He ordered his army to withdraw from Toulouse, claiming that he wished to spare the city and the French king. The siege was over, and Henry's army retreated, leaving behind a city that had withstood one of the greatest military forces of the time. The failure at Toulouse was a setback, but it was not the end of Henry's ambitions. The king had tested the limits of his power, and he had learned valuable lessons. But the true cost of the campaign was yet to be seen. The relationship between Henry and Becket, once so strong, had been strained. The seeds of a future conflict were sown, and the path ahead would be anything but smooth. In the summer of 1158, Thomas Becket rode into Paris with a grand procession. He was there as the Chancellor of England, representing King Henry II, to negotiate a marriage between Henry's young son and the French King Louis's daughter Margaret. This marriage was meant to create a strong alliance between the two royal families and secure a piece of land called the Vexin for the English. Becket put on a show to impress the French. He brought exotic gifts like dogs, monkeys, and a large group of well-dressed servants. There were hounds and hawks, and 8 big carts pulled by strong horses, carrying all sorts of valuable items. Each horse had a groom, and each cart had a big dog on a leash. Some carts even carried beer, which was a treat for the French who weren't used to it. There were about 250 men marching in groups, singing as they went, followed by more hounds and hawks, and then the knights and their horses. When Becket arrived in Paris, he gave gifts to everyone: barons, knights, scholars, and even the common people. It was a display fit for a king, and it worked. The French were impressed. Back in England, Becket was becoming one of King Henry II's closest friends and trusted advisors. Henry had first noticed Becket when he was working for Theobald, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Theobald saw Becket's hard work and ambition, and promoted him. In 1154, Becket became the Archdeacon of Canterbury, and in 1155 he was appointed as the English Chancellor. He was good at his job, and helped the king with the day-to-day running of the country. 12th century government was very different from what we know today. The king had a lot of people around him, and it was often chaotic. Becket was in charge of managing this group, making sure everything ran smoothly. He was tall and had a pleasant manner, and he enjoyed the finer things in life, like fine food and luxurious clothing. He had a large household in London where he entertained important guests and even educated the sons of nobles. Becket and Henry were very different. Henry was short, with red hair and a lot of energy. He was outgoing and liked to have fun, while Becket was more formal and cared a lot about traditions and rules. Henry sometimes poked fun at Becket, like the time he forcibly gave Becket's fancy cloak to a beggar. But despite these differences, they were good friends, and Becket was a trusted advisor. The relationship between the king and the church was always tricky. There were frequent arguments over who had the right to make certain decisions. In 1161, when Archbishop Theobald died, Henry saw an opportunity. He wanted someone who would support his plans, especially his goal to have his son crowned as the next king. He thought Becket would be the perfect choice for the job of archbishop. However, many people in the church didn't agree. They thought Becket was too much of a royal man and not educated enough in church matters. Even Henry's mother, Empress Matilda, tried to talk him out of it, but Henry was determined. On June 2, 1161, Becket was ordained as a priest, and the next day he became the Archbishop of Canterbury. At first, Henry was very happy with his decision, but soon he realized there was a problem. Becket, who had always been loyal to the king, started to change. He resigned from his position as chancellor, saying he couldn't handle both jobs. He began to fight for the church's rights, even against the king. He picked arguments over church lands and tried to strengthen the authority of Canterbury over other church positions. Becket's transformation was sudden and dramatic. He felt he needed to prove himself to his new role and to God. He became a strong and sometimes difficult opponent to the king, which was not what Henry had expected. Becket's behavior was a surprise to many, and even those who didn't like him were impressed by his sudden change. In 1163, Henry returned from the continent and was ready to push through some important reforms. He wanted to improve law and order, especially when it came to clergymen who committed crimes. At the time, clergymen were often punished more leniently by the church, which Henry thought was unfair. He wanted these criminus clerks to be tried in church courts, and then handed over to the king's courts for punishment if found guilty. Becket, however, refused to agree with Henry's plans. He saw it as an attack on the church's rights. This disagreement marked the beginning of a long and bitter conflict between the two men. Becket's new role as a defender of the church put him at odds with his former friend and mentor, King Henry II. The relationship that had once been so strong was now strained, and the two men would find themselves on opposite sides of a growing divide. In the summer of 1163, the air at the Council of Woodstock was thick with tension. King Henry II and Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, were at odds over a crucial issue: the church's payment of the sheriff's aid. This was a form of taxation that landowners traditionally paid directly to their local sheriff to help with maintaining peace in the county. Henry wanted to change this by bringing this revenue into the royal exchequer, centralizing the financial control and reinforcing his authority across the kingdom. Becket, however, saw this as an overreach and a threat to the church's independence. Becket stood firm, telling the king, "It does not become your excellence to deflect something that belongs to another to your use." He added that the realm would not be forced by law. This defiance enraged Henry, who swore a great oath and shouted, "By God's eyes, it shall be given as revenue and entered in the royal rolls, and it is not fit that you should gainsay it, for no one would oppose your men against your will." But Becket was undeterred. "By the reverence of the eyes by which you have sworn, my lord king, there shall be given from all my lands or from the property of the church not a penny," he declared. This bold stance, despite Becket having little personal stake in the matter, showed just how determined he was to challenge the king's ambitious reforms. The conflict between the two former friends intensified over the summer. Another major issue was the treatment of criminous clergy who committed crimes. Henry was frustrated that these clerks often went unpunished by the royal courts. Becket tried to address this by banishing and branding some criminous clerks, but it wasn't enough for the king. On October 1st, 1163, Henry called a royal council at Westminster, demanding that the bishops obey and observe the ancient customs of the realm. When Henry asked the bishops to recognize that a criminous clerk, once found guilty in the church courts, should be surrendered to the royal courts for bodily punishment, Becket and the other bishops responded with a vague answer, saying they would observe England's customs, saving their order. This non-answer effectively reserved the right to follow canon law over the king's laws. Henry, furious, left London without notice, leaving all business unfinished. The next morning, he demanded that Becket return the castles granted to him during his chancellorship and removed his son from Becket's care. This was a deeply personal and spiteful move that marked the end of their decade-long friendship. Henry later told Becket, "Were you not the son of one of my villeins, you would hear and rely too much on the manner of your assent," a comment that cut deep. The bad feelings lingered. Both men appealed to Pope Alexander III, who was in exile due to a conflict with the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick Barbarossa. The Pope urged Becket to cooperate, as did several cardinals and influential church leaders. In November, Becket, under pressure, agreed to submit to the king privately at Oxford. Henry, however, was not satisfied with a private agreement. He called a great council at Clarendon in January 1164, where he forced Becket to publicly declare that he would uphold all the laws and customs of the realm without condition. Henry then sprung a trap. He presented the Constitutions of Clarendon, a written document listing 16 points that included the king's desired scheme for criminous clerks and a limitation on appeals to the papacy. Becket was appalled and felt betrayed. He suspended himself from priestly duties and wrote to the Pope, begging for absolution. He also sought support from King Louis VII of France and attempted to flee to France but failed. In October 1164, Henry summoned Becket to Northampton Castle, where he was accused of embezzlement during his term as Chancellor. Becket appealed to the Pope, and Henry denounced this as a breach of the Constitutions of Clarendon. Faced with crimes against the crown and his soul, Becket panicked and fled the castle. He escaped to France, where he sought refuge with King Louis VII. He would not return to England for almost 5 years. During his exile, Becket lived at Pontigny Abbey, where he practiced a severe form of asceticism, punishing himself with cold baths and a strict diet. He wrote letters of protest to the Pope and excommunicated many of his enemies. Henry, meanwhile, focused on his broader concerns, including wars, alliances, and the management of his vast territories. The affair with Becket became an irritant, but the king had more pressing matters to attend to. The Empress Matilda, Henry's mother, died in September 1167. She had been a wise advisor and a source of stability. Her death marked the passing of a generation, and Henry began to think about the future. Eleanor gave birth to their last surviving child, John, in 1167, bringing the total number of their children to 7. These children would play crucial roles in Henry's plans for the future of his empire. The relationship with King Louis VII of France was a growing concern. Louis's son, Philip, was born in 1165, and this event sparked a new rivalry. Louis began to encourage dissent among Henry's subjects, including the King of Scots, Welsh princes, and the Bretons. Henry, in response, married his eldest daughter, Matilda, to Henry the Lion, Duke of Saxony and Bavaria, to maintain ties with the German states. He also planned for his eldest son, also named Henry, to rule over the entire Plantagenet patrimony, England, Normandy, and Anjou. Henry's third son, Geoffrey, was married to Constance, the daughter of Conan IV, Duke of Brittany. Henry forced Conan to abdicate, giving him the English earldom of Richmond in return. Brittany would be ruled by Geoffrey when he came of age, under the feudal tenure of his eldest brother, who would do homage to the King of France. Until then, Henry would rule Brittany personally. These moves were part of Henry's broader strategy to secure his dynasty and ensure a stable future for his children and his empire. The conflicts with Becket and Louis were just one part of a complex and ambitious plan. The air was thick with tension as Henry, the Plantagenet king, and his sons gathered at the conference in Montmirail. It was January 1169, and the kingdom's future hung in the balance. Henry had a plan to divide his vast empire among his sons, ensuring that each would have a piece of the pie. For Richard, his second son, this meant inheriting the rich and powerful Duchy of Aquitaine, his mother Eleanor's homeland. Eleanor, who was nearing the end of her childbearing years, longed to return to Aquitaine and rule it once more. With Richard by her side, she saw a chance to reclaim her former glory. King Louis of France, who had always coveted Aquitaine, was not entirely pleased with this arrangement. He had lost control of the region when Eleanor divorced him and married Henry in 1152. To ease the tension, Henry proposed that Richard would hold Aquitaine directly from the French crown. As a sweetener, he suggested a marriage between Richard and Louis's daughter, Alice, born in 1160. This plan, though generous, did little to resolve the underlying tensions between the two kings. The meeting at Montmirail was meant to bring peace, but it only went so far. The real obstacle was Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who had been in exile for 5 long years. Becket and Henry had once been close friends, but their friendship had soured over a bitter dispute. Becket arrived at the conference, surrounded by a crowd, and prostrated himself at Henry's feet. He pleaded for mercy, but his words were laced with a condition: saving God's honor. This was a deal-breaker for Henry. The king, already frustrated, exploded with anger, hurling insults at Becket and accusing him of pride and ingratitude. Despite the animosity, the territorial agreements were made, and the kings parted ways. But the Becket issue remained unresolved, casting a shadow over the newfound peace. In the months that followed, the tension only grew. Henry and Becket tried to reconcile again at Montmartre, but it was another failure. Becket, feeling betrayed, threatened to place England under an interdict and sought support from the Pope. In July 1170, Henry decided to take drastic action. He traveled to Westminster Abbey and had his eldest son, the young King Henry, anointed as co-king by the Archbishop of York. This was a direct snub to Becket, who saw it as an invasion of his authority. When Becket learned of the coronation, he was furious. He returned to England and on Christmas Day excommunicated the bishops who had participated in the ceremony. The situation was now critical. Word of Becket's actions reached Henry at his Christmas court in Bures, Normandy. Enraged, Henry allegedly exclaimed, "What miserable drones and traitors have I nurtured and promoted in my household, who let their lord be treated with such shameful contempt by a lowborn clerk?" 4 knights, believing they were acting on the king's wishes, rode to Canterbury Cathedral on December 29th and brutally murdered Becket. The murder of Becket sent shockwaves through Christendom. Henry, once the most powerful man in Europe, was now a pariah. The Pope threatened to excommunicate him, and public opinion turned against the king. To escape the mounting pressure, Henry fled to Ireland, a distant corner of his empire where he could regroup. Ireland was in turmoil. Civil war had erupted, and the King of Leinster, Diarmait Mac Murchada, had been deposed. He sought help from Henry, who allowed Diarmait to recruit Anglo-Norman barons, including the formidable Richard de Clare, known as Strongbow. Strongbow helped Diarmait regain his throne, and upon Diarmait's death, inherited the lordship of Leinster. Henry arrived in Ireland with a large army, not to conquer but to assert his authority. He received the submission of the Irish lords and reorganized the land, establishing his rule. As he worked, the outrage over Becket's murder began to subside. By spring 1172, Henry was ready to return to the continent and face the church. The Compromise of Avranches was signed, ending the breach between Henry and the church. It was a face-saving agreement, but it did not fully address the underlying issues. Just when Henry thought he had weathered the storm, a new crisis emerged. In 1173, his wife Eleanor and his three eldest sons, Henry the young king, Richard, and Geoffrey, rebelled against him. Young Henry, now 18, was frustrated by his lack of power and influence. Despite being crowned co-king, he had no real control over the lands and revenues he felt entitled to. His father-in-law, King Louis of France, encouraged the rebellion, fueling young Henry's ambitions. The rebellion spread quickly. Castles were garrisoned, and powerful allies joined the cause. Henry was caught off guard, but he soon realized the gravity of the situation. He was fighting on multiple fronts, and his empire was on the brink of collapse. The conflict dragged on for over a year, and Henry likened it to an eagle being pecked to death by its own chicks. The rebellion was a complex affair, with each son having their own grievances. Young Henry was driven by a desire for power and wealth. Richard, 15 at the time, joined his brother, possibly influenced by their mother, Eleanor. Geoffrey, 14, followed suit. Eleanor, long a loyal wife, had grown resentful of her husband's treatment. She saw an opportunity to regain her independence and perhaps even rule Aquitaine once more. Her role in the rebellion remains a mystery, but her actions were crucial in rallying the younger sons. Henry II, though surprised, was not defeated. He fought back with all his might, determined to preserve his empire. The conflict was a test of his leadership and resilience, and it would shape the future of the Plantagenet dynasty. Eleanor of Aquitaine, once a powerful duchess and queen, found herself at a crossroads in 1173. After years of bearing children for Henry II, she had returned to her role as the ruler of Aquitaine. However, Henry's actions began to undermine her authority. He granted parts of her duchy to others without her consent, treating it as part of his own kingdom rather than an independent territory. This left Eleanor feeling betrayed and stripped of her power. Eleanor was not only concerned for herself, but also for her favorite son, Richard. Henry's succession plan meant Richard would become the Duke of Aquitaine, but Eleanor feared he would have little real control. Determined to secure her son's future, she decided to take drastic action. In February 1173, she set out on a dangerous journey to Paris, planning to join forces with her eldest son and her former husband, Louis VII of France. Disguised as a man, she rode across the French countryside, but she was captured by Henry's agents and taken prisoner to Chinon Castle. Despite Eleanor's capture, her sons had already reached Louis VII. When Henry II learned of their rebellion, he sent messengers to Paris demanding their return. Louis VII, however, declared that the true King of England was with him, not Henry II. This marked the beginning of a widespread rebellion against Henry, with many lords and even the King of Scotland, William the Lion, joining the cause. The rebels made grand promises of land and wealth, but their strategy was flawed. They attacked on multiple fronts, hoping to overwhelm Henry, but this only played into his strengths. Henry II, known for his quick and decisive action, moved his forces swiftly across his lands. He used skilled mercenaries to break resistance and outmaneuver his enemies. In the summer of 1173, the rebels suffered several defeats, including one at Fornham where the Loyalists, led by Richard de Lucy, defeated a large force of Flemish mercenaries. The winter brought a temporary truce, but the fighting resumed in 1174. This time, Henry faced more serious threats, particularly from William the Lion, who had regrouped and was supported by Philip of Flanders. Henry, recognizing the importance of public perception, made a dramatic pilgrimage to Canterbury. There, he publicly sought forgiveness for the murder of Thomas Becket, a move that won him significant support. Just days later, William the Lion was captured at Alnwick, a victory that dealt a major blow to the rebellion. Henry quickly consolidated his power in England, and by August 1174, the rebellion was all but crushed. Henry then turned his attention to Normandy, where Louis VII and his allies had besieged Rouen. With his forces now united, Henry drove the French back, and Louis soon sued for peace. At the peace treaty of Mont-Louis, Henry showed mercy to his sons, restoring their lands and possessions. However, he was less forgiving toward Eleanor. She was placed under house arrest in various English castles, a punishment that kept her away from the duchy she loved and the power she once held. For the remainder of Henry II's reign, Eleanor remained a prisoner, though she occasionally appeared at court. Henry never fully trusted her again, and her dreams of ruling Aquitaine were dashed. Yet her legacy lived on through her sons, especially Richard, who would one day become the famous King Richard the Lionheart. Eleanor's story is a testament to her strength and the complexities of medieval politics, where loyalty and ambition often clashed, shaping the destinies of kingdoms and their people.